Waking later than usual the next morning, Izzy fumbled to release her hand from the heavy blankets pinning her down. Grabbing out for her mobile phone, she switched off its alarm, and through tired, hazy eyes she looked at its screen. 6:55 a.m. Oh no, she groaned to herself. The events of yesterday came flooding back. She had to go and spend the entire day and night at Pamela's house. She looked about her bedroom, trying to locate the pile of ironing she had done yesterday, as it contained all of the clothes that she would need for the next 24 hours. Jeans, t-shirt and a neat jumper for inside the Hines' house, and jodhpurs, thick socks, warm vest and an old jumper for riding. That was the only thing that Izzy was thinking about, riding. Gosh, at least I do get a chance to ride, she muttered to herself. The head of Izzy's bed was against a wall where the landing was that leads to all 3 bedrooms. Mr. and Mrs. Henley's bedroom was the first at the top of the stairs, and then it was Izzy's room, and at the end of the corridor was Jack's. Izzy's room contained 2 identical beds. The far end wall which separates her from her parents' room was where Izzy kept all of her lovely horse pictures. The wall at the bottom of the bed sloped quite dramatically, where the room is a dormer and built into the roof of the old coach house. Halfway down, someone from years past had put in a cupboard where Izzy housed all of her old toys that she just cannot bear to part with, and her collection of old pony magazines. Next to the cupboard is an alcove where Izzy's window sits. Below the window is an old rocking chair that had belonged to some distant relative, and now is the seat for a couple of her most favourite teddy bears. The only furniture in her room was along the wall that separates her bedroom from Jack's. A small wardrobe with a few summer dresses and other icky items of clothing that her mother sometimes made her wear, and next to that her dressing table. As she hardly ever went anywhere that she needed smartly dressing for, and in the absence of makeup that most girls her age were starting to experiment with, she just used her dressing table top as a bookshelf. Laying back in her bed and looking up at the ceiling, Izzy could see that the hatch that leads to what she guessed must be a very small loft space, as most of her bedroom was actually into the roof. She had never been up there. She had never really thought it necessary. All the storage space she needed for her few items was provided by her cupboard, which, as she'd grown taller and taller, she found it increasingly difficult to move about in her room without banging her head on its sloping sides. "Isabel, it's time to get up," Mrs. Henley's voice cut through the silence of the house. "Coming," replied Izzy as she heaved herself out from under her blankets, grabbed her school bag, upended it onto the spare bed, grabbed her pile of ironing and ran down the stairs, jumping into slippers and grabbing a dressing gown as she went. By 9 a.m. Izzy was being driven by her mother up the long gravel drive that led to Home Farm, where the Hines family lived and worked. Mr. Henley's old car croaked and groaned as it was driven over ruts and potholes, caused over the years by wear and tear from the farm's machinery. Home Farm was situated in the middle of a forestry commission, so that the drive that leads to it is bordered on either side by large plantations of row upon row of uniform pine trees, which eventually opened out into large plains of grazing land, which was usually covered with hundreds, if not thousands, of Mr. Hines's sheep. But with it being the middle of the winter, most of the far-off fields looked empty, and the sheep all seemed to be nestled into smaller fields, closer to the cover of the farm and the shelter of the Forestry Commission's pine plantations. The drive came up to the rear of the farm, then swung a sudden right into the farmyard, and then a very neat pebbled track to the left took them to the large stone farmhouse. It stood alone in the middle of a sea of neat pebbles that went all the way around the property, making the house stand out like a lighthouse that was just offshore. To the front of the house was a beautifully neat landscape garden with lots of shrubbery. The whole garden was bordered with a large evergreen hedge, making it appear like a brilliant oasis in the middle of the working sheep farm. As they got closer, Izzy could see the pony field to the rear of the house and 5 peacefully grazing animals that Izzy knew all too well. The smallest was Tuppence, a scruffy little piebald Shetland pony that had been Pamela's first. Next in size was Charlie, a 13 2-hands-high dark bay Highland pony, which had been bought to replace Tuppence when Pamela had started to learn to jump, as the tiny Shetland point-blank refused to even step over a pole, never mind jump one. Then, at 15 hands high, was Blaze, a black Anglo-Arab with a white blaze down the front of his very handsome face, hence his name. But when pony club shows started to get serious and competition horses needed to be able to do a bit of dressage, show jumping and cross-country. The other two horses were Mrs. Hines' Aventer Lucifer, a pure black Irish draught cross-thoroughbred that Mrs. Hines evented with all year. And last but by no means least was Boris, a huge chestnut Clydesdale cross-hunter type horse that Mr. Hines rode to local hunt meets and pottered about the farm on. Despite his enormous size, he was a big, laid-back old gentleman who was perfectly safe for the not very experienced Mr. Hines to clatter around on. Izzy looked into the field with total envy. How she wished her family were like the Hineses, and all the shared common interest of horses, sooner than it just being herself and her own private passion and desire that no one ever seemed to take any notice of. Pulling up to the front of the house, Izzy and Mrs. Henley could see Pamela and Mrs. Hines dash from the kitchen to meet them on the doorway. "Oh dear," began Mrs. Henley, as she saw that her friend's daughter was dressed in a very smart black pumps, thick black tights, and a very pretty dark blue velvet dress. Her hair hung in two very neat pigtails at either side of her head, and kept in place with a velvet ribbon that perfectly matched her dresses. Mrs. Hines was in a very business-type tweed suit, with ankle-length skirt, frilly blouse and fitted jacket. As Claire Henley stepped out of their ancient car, herself and her daughter almost matched perfectly in trainers, jeans, and smartly knitted jumpers provided by Izzy's grandmother. Claire's beautiful hair was held off her face with an old clip, and Izzy sported her usual scruffy blonde plait. "Well, how wonderful to see you both," announced Mrs. Hines, as she ushered both Izzy and her mother into the large kitchen, where she had an old kettle whistling from the top of their Aga. "Thank you so much for the kind invitation," Izzy said to her friend's mother, trying to do all the things she knew Jack would do in her bid to become more like him. "Don't even mention it," boomed Mrs. Hines. "Poor Pammy goes out of her mind stuck here in the middle of nowhere, when she has school holidays and her cousins aren't coming up to visit, don't you, darling?" "Yes, one does tend to get frightfully bored, being an only child. You are just so lucky having Jack to play with," Pamela said to Izzy. "I suppose I am," said Izzy. How strange that Pamela regarded her as lucky, when all Izzy could think about was how lucky Pamela was having 3 ponies of her own and a family that totally understood her passion. Jack and Isabel used to play together all of the time until we got his computer a few Christmases ago, and I'm afraid since then he's rather become a bit of a hermit, sitting in his room and killing zombies and chatting to friends. Poor Isabel now tends to spend quite a bit of time alone as well," Mrs. Henley explained to Pamela and her mother. "Now, you two dash along and take Izzy's bag upstairs, and Pammy, please be a dear and go and check on the washing machine in the utility. We want Izzy to have lovely clean sheets for her stay, don't we?" "Yes, Mummy," Pamela replied, and with that the two girls left the kitchen. Pamela pointed her way to her bedroom at the top of the stairs, which from previous visits, usually for past birthday parties, Izzy knew only too well, and Pamela went on to the utility room to sort out the laundry. As Izzy entered her friend's bedroom, she could see that it had not changed at all since her last visit, and it was in very stark contrast to Izzy's own room. The furniture included 2 single beds, a large wardrobe, a massive bookcase, and a dressing table. It was all made out of beautifully carved white painted wood, and was very frilly and girly compared to Izzy's own very practical, non-matching room. The walls were covered in a white and pink baby-coloured wallpaper, which was in a pattern of lots of happy fairies sitting in the centre, of beautiful flowers playing all kinds of instruments, making the whole walls a sort of silent fairy orchestra. Her curtains were of a delicate white material with pink tie-backs, and unlike Izzy's bookshelf, dressing table, Pamela's was covered in lots of little bottles of lotions and potions, and little plastic trays that contained items Izzy guessed to be makeup. Enviously, she looked out of the window, straight down onto the field where she could see all 5 of the horses huddled together, trying to keep as close to the house as possible for warmth against the freezing December wind. Under the windowsill, she glimpsed something she had never seen before, never taken notice of until now. A radiator! Wow, thought Izzy to herself. How rich are they to not only have 5 horses, but central heating throughout their entire house? Coming back down the stairs, after leaving her bag in Pamela's room, Izzy could hear both their mothers making polite noises to each other. Just making out their words, she heard, "Thank you so much for inviting Isabel over. I didn't like to ask you, knowing how busy you and your husband are this time of year, but Isabel has been a bit low recently, after the class were told about the Christmas fancy dress pony parade. And of course, not having her own pony, she cannot take part. So I thought it might be nice for her to come and play with Pamela. At least she can have a friend she can talk horses with," she heard her mother say. Izzy was mortified right down to her very inner core. How could her mother do that to her? As if she was some kind of charity case. She didn't want to be here, didn't want to play with other people or their ponies. She wanted to be at home on her own farm, playing with her own pony. "Don't mention it at all. Least we can do for her, isn't it, Pammy?" Mrs. Hines boomed by way of response to Izzy's mother. "Yes, it is. We love having Isabel here. She's always so much fun at my parties," Pamela lied to both women, for usually Izzy was very quiet and just went about in her own little world, talking to all of the animals when she came over, and barely took part in any of the games at all. Must be her lower breeding than mine, Pamela thought silently to herself. "Oh, help," Izzy thought again. Not only did Mrs. Hines think she were a charity case, but Pamela had heard them talking as well. Izzy wanted the ground to swallow her up, right then and there. She would have done anything to have not gone back into that kitchen, but she knew that was impossible to escape. So with flaming hot cheeks where her embarrassment was trying to escape her body, she took a deep breath and re-entered the kitchen. Her mother stood up as soon as she entered. "Well, thank you very much for the tea. I must be getting back to my jobs. So much to do and so little time to do it in, with Christmas now upon us," said Mrs. Henley. She went to kiss Izzy on one of her flaming hot cheeks. "Gosh, you're warm. Maybe you ought to take off that big jumper while you're inside, Isabel." Izzy glared at her mother, trying telepathically to tell her how much she hated her right now for setting this whole thing up, but making out like it had been an invitation from the Hineses in the first place. It didn't work. Mrs. Henley took no notice of her daughter's glaring eyes and was soon out of the door, followed by, "Lovely to see you again, Claire. Don't worry about Izzy. We'll bring her home tomorrow when the girls are ready. I've got to see Mr. Prest at the farm anyway about getting some tups back he used for his ewes last year. Bye-bye. See you tomorrow," Mrs. Hines said as she watched Mrs. Henley turn back down the drive on her way home. "Right then," started Mrs. Hines. "Go and play for a couple of hours before lunch, while you both still look so smart. Then after dinner you can go out on the ponies if the weather holds." Izzy hoped and prayed that the weather would hold. She still felt so embarrassed that her mother had actually asked the Hineses for her to go over, but she was also still determined to be like Jack, so she forced a smile across her face and was led up the stairs by Pamela into her bedroom, saying that it was warm enough up there to play for a couple of hours before Mummy would be ready with lunch. The hours passed quite pleasantly. Luckily, Pamela was intuitive to know that Izzy had never experimented with makeup before, so Pamela was quite happy having a living doll like Izzy to practice on. Izzy was happy to sit there and listen to her friend drone on about excited achievement after achievement with her ponies and how her life just got so horribly boring. Izzy could not imagine how anybody like Pamela could ever be bored, but she just sat politely nodding in all of the right places until the call from Mrs. Hines's voice came ringing through the house. "Lunch is ready, girls." With that, they both shot down the stairs, straight to the kitchen to sit down for their lunch of shepherd's pie, with lovely creamy mashed potato toppings served with wedges of freshly baked bread smothered in homemade butter. Izzy's mouth was just watering at the sight of such a feast. Mr. Hines had been washing his hands at the sink, but he soon came over and sat down to lunch with them. "Gosh, Izzy, you do look grown up with that makeup on, doesn't she, Mummy?" Pamela announced to the room. "She looks positively radiant, dear. You've done an amazing job with the colours. Nice and smoky, not too bright. Just suits her lovely complexion. But before to take it off before you go riding. You know the rules. No makeup outside of the house," Mrs. Hines replied. "Well, Izzy, you look just fine without the makeup," said Mr. Hines. "I don't know why you young uns want to grow up so quickly. There's nothing better in this world than the fresh face of youth." Then, lowering his voice and his head down to the table to share a joke with the girls, he said to Pamela, "I used to be fresh-faced and youthful before I met your mother." That was met with "Tut, hardly," from across the room where Mrs. Hines had heard her husband's comments, and they all started to laugh at his silliness. Izzy was shocked at how completely down-to-earth and fun the family were. She'd never been there on her own before. She'd only seen Pamela's family in entertaining mode at her past birthday parties, where they had both appeared so rigid and plastic, with no personality or humour. Just a couple that seemed to want to rush through parties to a strict timetable as quickly and painlessly as possible. They'd been a million miles away from the warm, laughing pair she was now sharing a meal with. After lunch, everybody was very full and happy. The girls had been excused from the table to go and get ready for their ride. Coming back into the kitchen just moments later, in their boots, jodhpurs, thick jumpers, and both free from the makeup that Pamela had so painstakingly applied earlier. "Right," said Mrs. Hines, looking back from the washing up. "Don't you two look professional all togged up like that. Now, Pamela, as Izzy is so much taller than you, and Mrs. Hendley informs me that Izzy can ride rather well, she's to use Blaze as her mount, and you can bring up the rear on Charlie." "Oh, but Mummy," Pamela started, obviously very put out that Izzy was to ride her favourite horse. "Now, Pamela Hines, Izzy is your guest, and she's much taller than you, so please show her your good manners and go tack up Blaze and Charlie," Mrs. Hines said to her now sulking daughter. Gosh, thought Izzy, she really did not want anything to be awkward between herself and Pamela. She genuinely liked spending that morning having her friend tell her about all of the different things she'd done with the horses. She didn't want things to turn funny now. What would Jack do in this situation? Izzy pondered silently in her head, and then it came to her. She had a plan, and she was determined to make it work, as she had really enjoyed her stay so far with the Hineses. It didn't take long for Pamela and Izzy to catch the ponies they intended to ride. Poor Boris was not impressed that he had not been chosen to be taken out of the field. Mr. Hines's huge hunter had trotted beautifully up to them, swishing his tail in an attempt to look like a much better steed than the other two they had chosen to ride, and because of what he saw as neglect at not being picked, he stood by the hedge and sulked away to himself. Even though Pamela was still in a bad mood, she said to Izzy, "Look at Boris. He's the biggest softy in Yorkshire. He has more personality in that solid frame of his than all of the other ponies put together. He actually thinks he's human, and gets quite upset to be put outside in a field with other horses." With that, Pamela lovingly clapped his neck, kissing his sulking face, and gave him a polo out of her pocket to try and cheer up the gentle giant. The girls walked Blaze and Charlie through the farmyard to where the stable block was situated, and Pamela, very pleasantly, even if she was still in a sulk at her mother's decision, helped Izzy with Blaze's grooming and tack, as he was very excited to be going out, so he danced about at the end of his halter rope, impatiently wanting to get out of the stable and on with the ride he knew lay ahead.